For kids who grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, it was sugary cereal commercials that dotted the television landscape. A common theme among all of them was advocating these products were a magical part of a complete breakfast, helping to ingrain the idea in our collective mindset. Of course, anyone who has even a modicum of knowledge about proper nutrition knows that regularly partaking in massive doses of extremely calorie-dense sugary cereal is not at all needed nor advisable in a complete breakfast. On this note, just to explicitly point out how nutritionally suboptimal breakfast cereals are, while you might think products like grape nuts or corn flakes would offer a better alternative to more sugary breakfast cereals, at least in terms of avoiding blood sugar spike, it should be noted that grape nuts has a glycemic index value of 71. For the uninitiated, the GI is a scale showing the effect of a given food item on one's blood sugar levels, with 100 being pure glucose. This 71 number is surprisingly higher than such sugary cereals as Fruit Loops, about 69, and Frosted Flakes, about 55. For further shocking reference, Corn Flakes has a mean GI of about 81, and Rice Krispies are at 82, while table sugar only has a GI of 60. That said, good nutrition is a lot more complicated than just looking at a single number, and there is definitely a place for food items high on the GI, particularly ones that offer other benefits like lots of fiber and micronutrients. It's just surprising how high the vast majority of breakfast cereals, even seemingly non-sugary ones like grape nuts, are on that index. So how did we get here? To begin with, while there certainly were exceptions, such as campaigning soldiers and intensive manual laborers, for most of human history it seems the majority tended to abstain from any sort of breakfast at all. In fact, eating a meal shortly after waking during the Middle Ages in the Western world seems to have been largely considered a form of gluttony, as noted by 13th century priest Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica. That's not to say nobody ate breakfast, however. Even in this anti-breakfast era in the Western world, those requiring a lot of calories to get through the day generally ate things like rye bread and beer in the morning, though it appears the more devout of these individuals tended to take their desire for a morning meal as a sign of moral weakness and their giving into it as something of a sinful act. Unsurprisingly, given manual laborers tended to be poor, beyond being considered somewhat gluttonous, eating breakfast in this era also tended to be looked down upon by the affluent as something only poor people did. That said, by the 18th century, things had changed dramatically, with certain of the English elite even starting to build designated breakfast rooms. This finally brings us to the 19th century and the more direct genesis of the sugary breakfast cereal we have today. It was in this era that many Americans were suffering from dyspepsia or indigestion, seemingly caused by a high-protein, high-fat diet largely composed of fatty meats and not nearly enough fiber. To combat this and other real and perceived ailments, alternate breakfast items began popping up, generally attempting to avoid meats and animal fats altogether. On top of this, with the Industrial Revolution, breakfast became less about socializing and more about quick consumption. The factory workers needed their caloric intake but didn't have enough time to prepare or eat a full sit-down meal. Enter breakfast cereals. The first modern designated breakfast cereal, forms of porridge aside, was invented in 1863 by a vegetarian Christian abolitionist doctor named James Caleb Jackson. Created for his sanatorium patients as a healthy start to the day, it was comprised of crumbled, twice-baked graham flour, which is essentially a type of non-bleached, finely ground whole wheat flour, and bran, hard outer layer of the grain. He called this creation granula, with the end product resembling a much harder version of modern-day grape nuts. Jackson's granula was reportedly so hard that it needed to be soaked in liquid for at least 20 to 30 minutes before it could be comfortably bitten into. In the 1870s, Dr. John Kellogg ran his own sanatorium in Battle Creek, Michigan, and was known for his very strange, sometimes sadistically abusive methods, including electrically shocking children's genitals, applying forms of acid to them, removal of the clitoris in females, and circumcision in males, all in an attempt to prevent masturbation and sexual urges. Interestingly, the latter male circumcision treatment, as something commonly performed in America, actually hails from this era. The modern non-Jewish, non-Islamic practice of foreskin removal was not really a thing in the Western world until it began to be seen as a way to discourage the evil of masturbation. In any event, Dr. Kellogg visited Jackson's retreat and was most impressed with his granula. So impressed, in fact, that he ripped off the idea, creating his own version of it made of wheat, corn, and ground oats. He uninventively called it granula. As a result, Jackson sued and Kellogg was forced to rename his cereal granola. A few years later, a failed Battle Creek suspender salesman named Charles W. Post partially knocked off Kellogg's product and started selling an exceptionally similar granola product he called grape nuts, claiming it could make one's red blood redder. As with Jackson, Kellogg and Post both pushed this food item as an ideal healthy food to start the day with, setting the trend that has continued through today for this line of product. And so it was that between Kellogg and Post at the turn of the 20th century, Battle Creek became a battleground for two companies that would come to define the world of breakfast cereal. For instance, legend has it that due to a mishap making a batch of the original version of graham crackers, originally created by Presbyterian minister Sylvester Graham as a way to curb sexual urges, and particularly the urge to masturbate, John Kellogg and his brother Will invented a product they unimaginatively dubbed cornflakes. Post, being a little more flamboyant, named his version of the same thing Elijah's Manna, meant as a striking allusion to the biblical story about the food that saved the wandering, starving Israelites. However, fairly quickly, religious groups protested, and Post changed the name to Post Toasties. Going back to Kellogg, ultimately the Kellogg brothers split over Will Kellogg's decision to recommend adding sugar to cornflakes to help it sell better, something Dr. John Kellogg found borderline blasphemous, as such a thing, in his opinion, encouraged sexual excitement. The two parted ways, with Will founding the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company, which went on to become the now billion-dollar Kellogg Corporation, which besides their tasty flakes was soon to also introduce another breakfast staple, Rice Krispies. As for his brother, John Kellogg stuck to his original principles and continued to dedicate his life to ridding the world of such evils as masturbation. Now, given the ladies of the house at this time tended to be the ones who decided what the family would eat, during the first few decades of the 20th century, cereal advertising was primarily aimed at housewives. In the late 1930s, however, as breakfast cereal became more established and commonly purchased anyway, cereal companies started thinking it might be best to skip the middlewoman, instead marketing directly to children who presumably would pester their mothers for which cereal they wanted. The problem here is that children tend to not like straight bran or wheat, but they do love sugar, and so it was that in 1939 the first pre-sugared cereal was produced called Ranger Joe Wheat Honeys, and things only ramped up from there. By the 1960s, cereal companies were devoting approximately 90% of their advertising budgets to directly appealing to individuals of the youthful persuasion. This is why it is so common today to have prizes in the cereal box, tie-ins with movies, video games, and TV shows, and products like ice cream cone cereal. As for widespread claims by the manufacturer that these cereals are part of a complete breakfast, technically the cereal companies are not lying here, given that the three primary nutrient groups known as macronutrients that humans need to survive are, in fact, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And indeed, cereal, even if it's simply a bowl of pure sugar, constitutes carbs. So these products can indeed technically be considered an essential part of a complete breakfast. Just perhaps not an advisable one, given the vast majority are essentially candy cleverly marketed to appear nutritious, often complete with a giant label on the side showing all the vitamins added to the product, along with the extremely tiny recommended serving sizes that nobody even comes close to following to mask the absolute massive number of calories and sugar most real-world servings of the product contain. Speaking of nutrition, ever wonder what the difference is between brown and white eggs? Well, check out our video on the subject here and wonder no more.